I'd like to open the floor for questions and answers. I see a couple of things in the chat, but that's on the side note, Pascal, asking if AFF can expand to a number of other African countries. I see West Africa and Sudan and Zimbabwe being mentioned, so that's for you to take along. But yes, let's have a look at the chat. I know my colleagues Miriam and Elizabeth are having a look at the chat.
Yes, I was actually able to harvest some interesting examples of lock-ins, and there's this compilation that refers to knowledge. So not only the use of knowledge, but the role of knowledge. For example, Matilda was saying that, yeah, knowledge is available, but what about actually making it happen? So there's a lack of putting the knowledge into action. Somebody also mentioned the example of farmers that perhaps they don't know that there are some plant protection products that are harmful for the environment. And you also look at the system and at the market around it, and these products are cheaper than the more organic alternatives. So picking a bit more on what Pascal said. And then also the idea of generally limited knowledge and professional type of knowledge. So if you look at monitoring, evaluation, and learning, that it's really important to move towards a food system transformation. Then there was also something in relation to mental and cultural barriers. So that's what Pascal commented at the beginning of his part. And also an interesting view on what is personal gain versus a more universal type of goal. So you look at private companies that try to seek power and look at their own profits over an overall benefit for larger population. Or you look at steel companies and macro coalition trying to manage price fluctuations over long-term best practices.
Thanks, Elizabeth, for this actually detailed overview of indeed of all the things mentioned in the chat. Are there any clear questions emerging here as well?
No, it's a very good highlight of what could be the causes of lock-ins, and often we refer to lack of knowledge.
Yeah,
that is indeed sometimes happening, but it's also about unequal access to information, like farmers not knowing, not being informed that there are alternatives on the market. So how can they actually be in support of a change process where they are actually not fully aware of the potential of those changes? And that can keep in a status quo from changing. But then even if they have that knowledge, other lock-in root causes can emerge. Knowing that there's an alternative, but it is not your business model, or the alternative appears to be more expensive than your common practice, could then again create another reason not to welcome that change. And I think that's a very common practice where we all know that a particular alternative is available, but that we are not yet ready or understanding how we can move to that different practice. And that in itself is very, very common, where knowledge, yes, indeed, it may be limiting, but even if knowledge is available, then you often see different causes of lock-ins emerge. And we have then to intervene with additional measures, not only to offer the alternative, but also to offer the other incentives that are required to adopt that alternative.
So there was a question on Curator by Mark Bavois, and they asked actually, what is the impact, or what do you think is the impact of the widespread reduction in aid and relocation of funds that we're currently experiencing, right? As US aid, but also UK government and other governments are cutting aid. How does that change the setup of the governance in donor countries and the setup of governance of food systems in donor countries, and also, of course, in the recipient countries, particularly in the recipient countries, I should say. How does it change the government? And perhaps also on a reflection on lock-ins. What can we say about it?
Very interested how Pascal perceives this question, but my very summarized response would be that in general, I consider it quite unhealthy that donors participate in the domestic governance of food systems. That has been the case for very long, where external parties take a position in how to steer a food system. And basically, now that a lot of donors are withdrawing, it creates incentive for national stakeholders to re-govern or reconfigure that particular governance, because a little bit of a vacuum is being created, which can also turn into the benefit of taking more accountability for the steering of food systems. And in that way, I think, of course, it is inconvenient and also not very supportive that many resources are being withdrawn. On the other hand, I think that the remaining resources can be better used to support the key stakeholders in domestic governance in their role to take part in the change of that food system. And that donors could indeed withdraw and provide more support to the key stakeholders than taking part themselves in the governance of a food system.
Thanks. So perhaps a blessing in disguise then. Pascal, what's your view on this?
Definitely agree about the fact that this is actually a good opportunity for, particularly in Africa, like our African food systems to take the responsibility for the outcomes, and also to learn to be more resilient and find the solutions within our own ecosystem without always having to wait for someone from Europe or from US to come and bring solutions to the lock-ins or to the challenges we are seeing in our food systems. Maybe to be even more practical, because Bart touched the more like systemic impact. Like the African Food Fellowship is still funded. The last 5 years was funded by donors. I still see in the coming years, like a couple of years, there will still be depending or fundraising from the typical philanthropy. But part of my responsibility now is also look at now that we are forced into this situation, which we should have been looking at like for decades ago, of trying to find commercial solutions to the problems we have in our ecosystem within the local markets. So I'm looking at like how can, for example, the African Food Fellowship continue to survive like in 10, 20, 30 years without having to rely on external funding, for example, like on donor funding. So at the same time, you're also seeing a lot of like new opportunities emerging. Yes, it's the mentality shifting, but also new opportunities, for example, in technology, which can allow us to see, to have the kind of like a systems view that was not possible before. So you can now see like who's doing what. As long as something has been published on the internet, it becomes very easy to find. And all these new opportunities, I think, are timely and could be part of actually helping build more resilient food systems moving forward. So less money, it's not necessarily a problem. I see it more as an opportunity to rethink how we govern our food systems and be more resilient and be more efficient in the way we do things.
And I have a question to you, Pascal, if I may.
Yeah.
When I reviewed many questions on the modules of the participants, they kind of depict an ideal governance situation where stakeholders come together and they steer the food system, and that they refer to, hey, that's the way we can reset the rules, we can reset the institutions, etc. And then I posed the question, but who could initiate that process? from your domestic setting of stakeholders, and you're not happy with the current way of governance, which is too skewed to a few interests of a few parties. And the solution could be expanding that governance to stakeholders who can then jointly steer that process. But who in a food system can take that initiative? Who is the mediator? And you, Pascal, you speak about African Food Fellowship with leaders. And that's the way you like to contribute. How do you see leadership in the process of re-governing?
Yeah, it's a very good question, but when I look at food systems, at least in my experience, why certain things continue to happen despite the things we say in policy papers, in big declarations, with our heads of states, with all the commitments that are made left and right, all the panels and the keynote speeches we hear in the conferences and the workshops. But at the end of the day, the outcome continues to be tending towards the negative. Yet we all seem to agree that something needs to happen, but who indeed will do that? So at least from my entrepreneurship background, incentives matter a lot here. So if the status quo today is benefiting a certain category, it does not matter whether this category is in the government or private sector, they really do not have deep incentive to change it because it is benefiting them. For example, in our case, the example I mentioned earlier for potato, for the packaging of potato chips. So the importers, for them, they had no incentive to change that system because they were still benefiting from it. They could still continue to import from outside of the country. But the people that feel the pain most, I think those are the people that should that have the biggest incentive to initiate the conversation. And when it comes to, for example, what we are doing at the African Food Fellowship, we work with food system leaders that come from the public sector, from the private sector, from the civil society, from research, and we help them to develop that kind of systems view, what is going on, what are the challenges, who is indeed benefiting from this situation, which in some cases, actually in most cases, is not the ideal situation, and who is struggling most from the status quo. And if you happen as a leader, let's say you are in a private sector, you happen to be struggling with a certain issue, within the African Food Fellowship, part of our leadership program, we help you also yes, you have identified the challenge, you see what's happening, see who is benefiting, who is struggling, who else is struggling. That's actually also quite important. And then we also help you to develop that inner capabilities. Actually, I can go out and talk to my competitor, talk to the other person who is also struggling, and we create a coalition and then come up with some sort of a solution. We call it food systems action, which even through the African Food Fellowship, we can even fund if need be. And then you start the conversation. So the people that are struggling most are the ones that with the biggest incentive to start the conversation. So we cannot point to the government if the government is actually benefiting, maybe people in the government.
I'm afraid we're losing Pascal.
But I can take his voice because I understand indeed that we should not always count on the government to initiate this process. And I think you participants, the participants of this course, you are now inspired people. You as inspired people, you can also call other people together and discuss this topic of lock-ins and bring that information and then see, hey, can we create a coalition? A coalition because you yourself as an individual, you're not empowered to change the system, but you need coalitions to face the power of those who are maintaining the situations, the status quo. And only coalitions of the willing in your particular settings, in your understandings, can make that difference. And I think you and all participants, we can act as mediators or initiators of that process. In particular context, in your situation, you can make a difference yourself.
Yeah, I fully agree, and thanks for taking over from Pascal. And I think that's all more or less also the story he was sharing, or had almost shared. I'm afraid the internet connection with Ethiopia is unfortunately lost.
We have a nice question by Stephanie. So previously she asked to Bart, would you argue that resistance can ever be fully overcome? And then she elaborates on this question saying, given the limited capacities, how do you suggest we prioritize which actors' resistance we address? Are there situations where we have to accept resistance from certain actors?
Yeah, it's a very good question, because I think resistance is not always bad. There is also value in sometimes the cultural values that bring people to maintaining a certain situation. So let's be careful also about resistance. It's also about accepting and respecting the causes of resistance. So we have to be careful there. We have to analyze what is really resistance to change, which keeps us from improving the system, but there may also be very good reasons to resist a particular bad change. So be nuanced. And then indeed, the question is indeed, who sets the rules? Who sets the change process in motion? Who has that legitimacy to say, hey, this will take our system to a higher level of performance? I don't have. Maybe you have, but it's quite often a coalition of different stakeholders who together decide that the current situation is not satisfactory, and together they decide to lift it to a higher level. But again, be aware that setting the rules and setting the interests of that particular change process is a political process, which can be contested, and there can be resistance, there can be change agents in favor. You're playing a semi-political game, and be aware of that. And that's not bad, because that's reality. And we cannot make it simpler than it is. So it is about who are actually the legitimate representatives of that common interest. It can be, of course, the government, if it is elected, etc., but it can as well be any other entity in the food system that has a legitimacy, a representativity of particular stakeholders. And I think that is the very important issue. And always be honest to yourself and say, hey, am I reflecting my own interest, the interest of a particular stakeholder group? Can I associate that? Can I align it with other interests? And if there is resistance, is there sovereignty in that resistance in terms of, hey, maybe there is a good reason to resist? Or can we help that resistance overcome with the incentives that also Pascal referred to?
Yes. Thanks. And also great to see you back, Pascal. Good to see the internet connection restored. But took over more or less, I think more or less also capturing or finishing the argument that you were making. It's almost time. I mean, and before Bram comes in and cuts us off, Elizabeth, perhaps a final question from the chat to either Pascal or Bart or both.
Yes, there is a question in relation to smallholder farmers, and Pius is asking, many lock-ins are bared by smallholder farmers. From experience, how can we improve agency for these actors to address these lock-ins, for example, with access to credit?
Well, that can be indeed a solution, but first we need to analyze, and we have to question our own assumptions, why smallholders resist certain change. Too often we impose certain assumptions which are not true, actually. When you look closer and you ask these smallholders what is actually their interest and what is their purpose, what keeps them from moving toward a different practice. Too often we impose these assumptions, telling them, hey, you are risk averse, but maybe they are not risk averse. They have good reason to resist. So be careful with that. And I also would like to refer to Nadia, who actually refers to a very important lesson. Small changes are also very valuable. And sometimes a small change, a small win, can set into motion a big process of change. Transformations not always happen at the top. They are not always designed. And many often situations, transformations start very small. And because of the success of a small change, it may change the whole system.
Thanks. Pascal, final words for you.
For me, again, it's all about incentives. Trying to understand who is benefiting from a particular status quo, a particular system, and also trying, if you want to change it, try to see who else is struggling, like who is most incentivized to see the change happen. And if you can, form a coalition with those people, reach out to them, and together you form the coalition that gives you legitimacy to initiate the conversation that leads to potentially the transformation of a food system. But again, I would not expect the government in the most cases to be the one that will make change happen, unless the government is immediately affected by the status quo. And in most of our experiences, we see that the government is just like not some random entity there. It's people in the government that I'm talking about. And if those people are not incentivized to make the change, or at least they don't feel the most pain, I would not say let's sit and wait for the government to solve our problems. So if you feel the pain, identify the people that feel the same, the pain, form a coalition, build the legitimacy, and go to the people that answer the conversation, go to the people that that have the power and the ability to make that actual change happen.
Thanks, Pascal and Barton. I think it's a very positive, upbeat story of indeed we don't should wait for the government, but there's action that we could take in our hands to change or to help transform the food system. So I like it very much, that message. We also have, of course, very high hopes from all the participants after this session. So we expect to see many great changes affecting the food systems all over the world soon. No pressure, everybody online. But I hope everybody found it useful and relevant, and sees the opportunities to apply this in their work, even if it's a very small scale or small steps. And then we have achieved our mission for this session today. With those words, I would like to give it back to Bram for some final practical notes, if there are any.
Thank you, Ezra, and thank you, Pascal, for joining us, and for Bart for the presentation, and Elizabeth and Ezra for moderating. And for that, I would like to close the session and thank everyone for their active participation. If you have any remaining questions or things you would like to share, you can do that in the plenary session learning block in Module 4, where I've already shared the PowerPoint and the Mentimeter as well, and where the recording will be shared in a few hours as well. Thank you, everyone, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Thank you so much.